I want to welcome everybody once again to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Professional Webinar Series. Today's webinar is Shade Gardening with Dr. Gail Hansen, and I'm sure it's going to be a great presentation today. She's going to provide an overview of landscape design ideas for shady areas. And this webinar is approved for 1 FNGLA, Florida Water Star, LIAF, or Landscape Architecture CEU. There is a $10 administration fee to receive a certificate for continuing education, and I'll put that link in the box if you haven't already made payment for that certificate, if that's something you're interested in. So this webinar is part of our monthly webinar series held on the second Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. We'll continue this into 2022. And Tom and I have lined up some amazing speakers for next year as well. So please make sure you're signed up for our educational announcements so that you'll get the list of the upcoming seminars. I'll put a link for that in the chat box as well. And with that said, our next webinar for 2022 is a turf and landscape disease update with Dr. Phil Harmon. Another announcement I would like to make is we will be announcing the Florida Friendly Landscaping Awards winners tomorrow. So be sure to check out our webpage to see the winners of this year's award banquet. So as always, your microphones have been muted. So please put your questions in the chat box and we'll take them at the end of the presentation. One last thing I would like to make you aware of is we'll be sending out a very short, probably 3 to 4 question survey for the people who have attended our webinars throughout the year. And we really appreciate it if you took a few minutes to fill this survey out for us. This is great information that our administrators like to see. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom Wickman to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And again, my name is Tom Wickman. I'm the statewide coordinator for the Green Industries Pest Management Practices Program, all part of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Gail Hansen. Dr. Hansen is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Horticulture and an extension specialist in sustainable landscape design. Her teaching and extension programs address sustainable, science-based, and art-centered landscape design practices that take into account the social dimension of green urban environments, environmental protection, and the quality of life for urban dwellers. Dr. Hansen graduated with a master's and a PhD in landscape architecture from the University of Florida and currently teaches courses in residential landscape design, sustainable design, and a new course in urban ecology of the built environment. Dr. Hansen is faculty in the Center for Land Use Efficiency and is an advisor to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. Today, Dr. Hansen is going to provide some suggestions for your shady landscapes. It's my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Gail Hansen.
Good morning. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for our last webinar of the year. I'm sure everyone's getting ready for the holidays and things are ramping up and getting pretty busy right now. So I appreciate you attending this webinar. So today I'm going to talk about shade gardens. And I thought I would start out with a couple of inspirational photos here for you. These are pictures of what I consider to be the biggest, baddest, most awesome shade garden in the United States. It's the Redwoods in Northern California. And I thought that they might be very inspiring for you because they are probably the epitome of an example of a rain garden. These pictures here, on the one on the right is my mom, who is standing next to a large redwood that had fallen many years ago. And the other one is my nephew, who is actually about 5'10" or so in height. And he's walking around the base of one of the large trees there. So one of the most amazing things about this particular, the redwood stands, and this is by the Avenue of the Giants, is that besides having these huge, huge trees, one thing that's really interesting, if you really pay attention as you walk through, is all the plants in the understory. There's some amazing mushrooms and fungi and different plants and all sorts of moss and ferns and lichens and so forth. So it's this juxtaposition of these very small plants and then these huge trees. So it's kind of like a magical place actually to be. And so I thought I'd start by thinking about, what is a shade garden exactly? So I think that we've all probably heard this saying that to be considered to be in shade, you have to have 6 hours or more of shade for it to technically be a shady area. And the same with sun, 6 hours or more of sun for it to be in a sunny spot. But I think that I like the definition of a garden that is in shade most of the day, which means like 2 hours or less of sun. And when we say 2 hours or less of sun, basically we mean 2 hours or less of early morning sun, not late afternoon blazing sun, and also part sun. So I'm going to be talking about a garden that really needs to be in the shade all the time. But to me, as a designer, a shade garden is more of an opportunity to grow some really interesting and unusual plants and to create kind of this magical place to hang out, to relax, to enjoy the wildlife that also appreciates having a little bit of shade on a hot day. And more than anything, a place to stay cool in our hot, especially Florida summers. So when I think of a shade garden, it always brings to mind this illustration. And it's from one of my favorite books called The Art of James Christensen, A Journey of the Imagination. And whenever I need some inspiration, I go and look at his very richly illustrated book with these fantastical kind of settings that he creates and these unusual people in these settings. And this particular illustration in his book is called Forest Fisherman. And, he has this nice little gilded, I don't know what you would call it, some sort of like a sword. It's an insect gathering instrument, it looks like there. And he's bringing along his little pet mouse, and he's got his unusual way of carrying his jelly sandwich for lunch there. But even more is the creatures that are shown in this, very dark, shady garden, the frog with wings and so forth, and a fish going through the garden. So it's really what I think of. He has illustrated perfectly what I think of as a shade garden as being a magical place. So what makes shade gardens so special? To me, it's the play of the light and shadow. And it's that extra dimension that you get when you see the patterns that are created, even on the turf and on your hardscape, on stones and everything, the patterns that are created and the shapes that are created on the different surfaces of your landscape. It could even be on the sides of your building or the walls of a courtyard. And these are dynamic. The shade patterns and the sunlight and the shadows change all the time. So they create a place that has constant interest with these different patterns. And it also creates more, it gives more texture, more depth to what you're seeing in the plant material and so forth. And it can also highlight colors and plants when they do have that spot of sun on them, and they look like they glow from the small amount of light compared to the kind of dark shadow areas. So the photo on the left here shows some, looks like umbrella sedge, which has a little bit of sunlight shining on it, which makes the foliage kind of glow. And the photo on the right shows you how you can have some, color in the landscape, but the pink begonias seem to just kind of glow in this muted light. And I think that's one of the things that make a shade garden so interesting. So beyond, the aesthetic appeal of having shifting shade patterns and light patterns and so forth, there's a lot of benefits to having shade. And actually, shade gardening has become one of my favorite ways to garden. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I don't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday in order to get my gardening done before it's blazing hot outside, because I can still work in my garden, later on in the morning, and it'll be cool enough in the shade. So benefits of shade for people and wildlife, obviously temperature control. I know that all of you have had that experience where you're out in the sun and then you walk under the shade of a huge oak tree like the one over in the right side. That's a garden in St. Augustine, and you immediately can tell the difference in the temperature, and it's oftentimes can be a 10-degree difference or more. And also we need to be protected from solar radiation. And all of you know that when you go out in your yard in full sun, you have to wear that sunscreen, you have to wear that hat, you have to have all sorts of protection against the sun. And if you're in a nice shady spot, it's not as much of a concern. And we know that solar radiation is obviously not good for us for various reasons. Skin cancer being one of the biggest issue. For plants, the benefits of shade is a lot of them do need protection from extreme heat. Even plants that do well in full sun sometimes cannot take that combination of full sun and high heat in the summer. And you'll see that when plants wilt and you know that they're being affected by that heat. And a lot of plants need protection from that direct solar radiation also. So the big deal about trees, not so much the shrubs and the ground cover plants, but the trees, is that if you have trees next to buildings and you can have cast shade on the building or like above the building or structures, it's also a great way to save energy. It'll keep your house cooler, and obviously your air conditioner will be a little bit more, won't be taxed quite so much. So I wanted to address some of the misperceptions that people have about gardening in the shade. One thing is that a lot of people ask me, the plant palette is so limited, what can I grow in shade? Well, actually, there are a lot of plants that you can grow in shade, and the picture on the left, this is my shade garden in front of my house, and it doesn't show the entire garden, but I think I have at least 20 different plants that do well in shade, and it's a good mix of plants. So as compared to the photo on the right, which is all mondo grass, which is, I think, the default plant that almost everybody uses here, at least in Gainesville, for a shady area. And so your shade garden does not have to look like that with, just one plant there. And the other misperception is you can't have colorful plants in your garden. And so obviously my shade garden is proof that you can have some colorful plants. And let's look a little bit more at some of these plants with color. So one of the issues that people will ask me about is, I have plants, they're in my shade garden, but they don't bloom very well, or they don't bloom as profusely or as often. And they want to know if the shade is the reason for having the lack of flowers. But all three of these plants here were these pictures I took in shade gardens. And so you can see that if you have the right plant and it has the right conditions, and it's not just shade conditions, but soil conditions and so forth, that you can have really spectacular blooms in shade gardens. And in fact, in many plants, they do better and bloom more in the protection of the shade. So another comment that I often hear is it takes so long for me to get plants to grow in my shade garden, and it takes a long time for you to get that full planted look. So I put in here a timeline actually of when I was planting my shade garden. And it starts over here on the photo on the left, and you can see that there's not very many plants in there. And in fact, I've got the equipment out there, a ladder and some other junk out there that we were using to put to install this shade garden. And by the way, that pathway with the stones, stepping stones and the gravel is actually a rain swale, a stormwater swale. All the water that comes down my driveway and into the walkway toward my house gets diverted into that swale, and it takes it through the pathway around the corner of my house and then down the hill. So I incorporated that into the rain garden. And this particular, I think we were installing this garden in, I want to say November. And then the next two pictures show the garden as it looked about 5 months later. And so you can see that a lot of the plants that is 5, maybe 6 months later, that a lot of the plants that we put in that were actually pretty small, including, for example, in the middle photo, the Xanadu philodendron, the begonias, where it was just a tiny little pot there. Some of the cast iron plant and so forth were pretty small plants, and within 6 months they had filled out quite nicely, and the rain garden was looking pretty good. So it might be just a kind of a perception that people have, but I don't think that rain gardens really take any longer to grow than gardens that you might plant out in the sun. Another misperception is finding plants that, especially colorful ones, that will grow both in part shade and shade. So there's maybe this limited plant palette because plants can either only take full sun or full shade, and then there's that kind of curious place in between where they're going to get some sun some part of the day and then shade the rest of the day. And I do agree it is a little bit harder to find plants that can withstand both of those conditions, but I put in a photo here of one that's actually a new plant, this Marble Mahonia, good for part shade, and you can see it has this beautiful, incredible bloom on it. It's actually a gorgeous plant. And I plan to get one for my shade garden. So you have to search, I think, a little bit more for those plants that can take both of those conditions, but they're out there. And the photo on the right is a photo from the greenhouse, the conservatory in the National Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C. And you can see that has sun and shade conditions, and they have a lot of plants growing in that particular conservatory. So what are some of the challenges of gardening in the shade? Well, I think the biggest one is changing seasons, because changing seasons means changing sunlight. The sun is actually in different places, different times of the year, depending on if the sun is directly overhead or if it's low on the horizon, like it is right now in the winter. In the winter, your sun patterns might be the shade that they're casting, like from large trees and so forth, might be a lot longer, for example, because of the position of the sun. In the winter, if you have deciduous trees and they lose all their foliage, you might have a lot more light in the area where you intend to have your shade garden. The sun, however, in the winter will be a little bit weaker, so it may not really affect the plants too much. And in the summer, you might have spots of intense sunlight when the sun is directly overhead. And so you have to kind of observe the area where you want to have your shade garden. I would say, especially in the summer because of the intensity of the sun, and try to notice where you're going to have some spots of direct overhead high sun. I'll give you an example. In my garden, I put in a cast iron plant, which usually needs deep shade, in one spot that I thought was going to be plenty of sun, but we planted the plants in, at the end of the year. And by the time the summer came around, I noticed this one little plant got just a funnel of intense sunlight right on top of it. And I had to move it because it wasn't doing well. So one of the things you have to do as you're creating your garden is really observe the sunlight patterns and shade patterns and kind of try to figure out how to locate your plants based on those patterns. So how much shade is the question? And, unless you're there at your house all day and you're kind of tracking the movement of your shade patterns and so forth, it might be a little hard for you to tell what areas of your yard get a lot of shade. And again, talking about that full shade, where it's 2 hours or less of sun, or part shade. But there's some clues that you can look for that will tell you if a particular area is pretty much in shade all the time. So for example, if you have stone or rock or anything, that you might have some moss or some tiny little ferns or lichens that need pretty much full shade. If you notice those growing, then you can be pretty sure that you are in a full shade area. And another example is if you have moss growing on your hardscape. Here's a driveway in my neighborhood that has moss growing on it, which actually I really loved it. When I walk and I check out this driveway, it's a lot of fun. Also, obviously, it had quite a bit of moisture on it too, but the really fun thing about this driveway is at different times of the year, it's bright green, and then sometimes there's no moss at all on it. So it's kind of this like magical driveway that turns different colors. So there's also this question about what kind of garden styles can you use for a shade garden? Well, really you can use any garden style, but some of them lend themselves more to a particular style. For example, if you want to go with a more natural woodland style, that's the perfect opportunity. The picture on the left is an example of that. It's kind of more of a managed natural because it does have some turf in it, a little bit of turf, but it's primarily in shade all the time, and the rest of the plant material is all pretty natural, and it looks almost like a woodland or a forested look. Another one is the tropical gardens, which we're all familiar with here in Florida, that have masses of plant material and a lot of trees with shade, very lush, and almost jungle-like in appearance. And so these two different types lend themselves very well to a shade garden. But there's also some different garden styles that you might recognize that do well as a shade garden. And one of them is the top middle photo there is a cottage garden. And cottage gardens have that oftentimes that jumble of different plants in the plant beds and a lot of plants. It's a very lush, nice look. They also have a lot of flowering plants. But you can grow those flowering plants in shade. This is a neighbor down the street from me, and she has a very large tree that's just out of the photo there. So she has complete shade in her garden in pretty much all day. And she has what I would consider a cottage garden that's doing very well in the shade. Asian style, especially the Japanese gardens are, famous for being kind of like shade gardens. And so you can grow ferns and other plants that you would typically see in a garden that is an Asian or Japanese style. The photo on the far right is an old Spanish style courtyard. You can see obviously that the fountain has seen its better days as a fountain and has been converted to a planter. But this is a small, nice, shady courtyard. It definitely has kind of that Spanish style to it, and it lends itself very well to having a very shady, very pleasant courtyard to be in. The bottom middle photo is a contemporary Japanese garden. It actually had in it the typical stone Japanese lantern, although in this contemporary garden it was made out of metal. But I just wanted to show this one to you to show that contemporary gardens are also do very well as a shade garden. And in contemporary gardens, you often use more elements in your garden. And so that's another reason to use it as a shade garden, because the elements that you have in your garden, which I'll talk about in a minute, usually aren't affected necessarily by shade, except for a couple of the hardscape materials. And then, of course, in Florida, we have a lot of different homes with pool enclosures. This particular photo that I have here, I just got off the internet because I personally didn't have a lot of photos of a really good enclosed garden, but the pool enclosures provide some shade. It's also helpful, though, if you have some other trees around, because the screen itself is not a completely shady environment. But you can grow, and because the temperature of the pool water moderates the temperature around the pool, you can grow a lot of tropical plants. For example, I know people here in Gainesville who grow more tropical plants in their pool enclosure, and the screen helps to give it that a little bit of shade there. Ponds are also a great place, if they have trees around them, to have a kind of a unique aquatic garden. This particular pond doesn't show a lot of aquatic vegetation in the water, but around the pond. But you actually can grow quite a few aquatic plants in shadier environments. But I also wanted to mention the swept yard. Many of you are probably familiar with this concept, a very old concept here in Florida and a lot of places, probably more in the Panhandle and here in North Florida. The idea of the swept yard was to keep the area around your house clear of vegetation. And that was to keep critters from living in the vegetation and going under your house or getting in your house. And so it was a technique that decades ago people used to use here in Florida. And it's basically just raking, or in years ago, in that case, they used some very coarse brooms to actually sweep the sandy area to keep the vegetation down. A more modern version of it is shown in the other photo next to it, where there is a large wood deck that surrounds the tree, but then you can see where the stepping stones, the square stepping stones, lead to the bridge. There's no plant material, or very little plant material in that area, and that is a kind of a modern version of a swept yard where it's kept free of vegetation. So these yards, these swept yards, if they're in the shade, that helps because less you'll get less weeds and so forth growing there, but also they can be very dramatic and very interesting. You do need to use more hardscape and other features to give it some interest, but it's another type of landscape or a style of landscape to consider if you have a very high shade area, is that you don't necessarily have to have plants covering the ground everywhere. I have a neighbor a few doors down who has a swept yard, and she has total canopy, tree canopy coverage over her yard. And I think it looks fantastic. It's just very cool looking. And I would do that in my yard, except I don't have quite enough trees to make enough shade. So there's other gardens that you can consider where you can put plants that grow in the shade, and that's container gardening. A lot of us have covered porches, we have the patios, we have lanais, we have places where we actually create shade with our buildings, with arbors and pergolas and structures, because we are always seeking shade in Florida. If you want to go outside in the middle of summer and enjoy the outdoors, you have to be in shade pretty much. Otherwise, you're not going to be enjoying it. And other areas like covered walkways, porticos, places where there's structures, again, that provide the shade, and you can put a lot of potted plants in those areas there. The other place that I often discover some really unique plant combinations and plants in pots that are very shady is old courtyards. These two pictures were taken in St. Augustine, so you can see the coquina stone and some really old courtyards here. Balconies, also, a lot of people will put, there's shade over their balcony, and it's a covered area that they'll put potted plants. This particular picture on the right was taken of some potted plants underneath a balcony on one of the old back alleys in St. Augustine. And you can see, obviously, there's a lot of shade there because you can see all the little ferns and mosses that are growing in the step and along the walkways there. And then there is a real plus to putting plants in containers because they're movable often. So the one obviously on the left is a movable container, and the one on the right is not. But there are a lot of big planters now that you can purchase that have casters with wheels on them that you can have out on your deck if you have an open deck, and you can move it around. So you can literally move the plants as the shade moves. And you can start out with them maybe in the early morning with the light, less intense summer or early morning sun, and then wheel the planter over into a shady area. So that makes your shade garden a little bit more useful if you can literally just move it around to follow the shade. So some of the characteristics, plant characteristics that we typically see in shade gardens are these plants with very large, broad leaves. Some examples are like the cast iron plant, some gingers, philodendron. Caladium is another one. And then the farfugium, which is also called the tractor seat plant or leopard plant, which is in the photo up above. And that picture, it was actually taken at the Jacksonville Zoo. And it was one of my favorite places in the zoo because right behind these farfugium, there's several stands of gigantic timber bamboo. And the contrast between the very tall bamboo with the very fine leaves and the canes of the bamboo and these beautiful farfugium plants was really a very dynamic and nice garden. So one of the things that we often find with these plants, with the broad leaves and so forth, is that they have a smoother texture in the foliage. The big leaves look relatively smooth and often shiny, have a shiny appearance to them. So when you're looking for variety in form and texture, That smooth texture is actually a very nice one to mix in with other plants that have maybe a little bit more coarse texture in the foliage. And then talking a little bit more about form and texture. Oftentimes, your garden, your shade garden, will have times of the year when it doesn't have as much color in it. For example, when flowers aren't blooming and so forth. And that's true also for a lot of sun gardens. But those times of the year when it doesn't have a lot of color, except for obviously the greens, you are going to be dependent more on form and texture to provide interest to your garden. So that's where you want to look at some really interesting mix of textures. So adding some very fine texture like your ferns, your mondo grass, your liriope, with thin strap blade plants and so forth, mixing those in with the pictures that you saw in the previous slide of the very broad leaf, shiny leaf plants, gives you that variety in texture. And also adding some plants that have very coarse texture as opposed to that smooth, shiny kind of look of the broadleaf. So your kunti, your cardboard plant, bromeliads, your cycads, your sagos, and your palms all give that much more coarse texture. So there are, really some very different textures that you can add, which can make your garden interesting beyond just trying to create, a lot of different color. And so a lot of these plants, the forms of the plants are also very different. And that helps create interest in your garden. One of the special things I think about shade gardens, if you have a lot of trees, is you can really think about the trees that you have in your garden and try to find some with some really interesting branch patterns and, some kind of curvy lines or zigzag lines, kind of jagged lines in your branches. Because it's always a lot of fun to look up and see these really interesting canopies that's providing your shade. And that adds another dimension to your garden and also another view of your garden, so that you're not always just paying attention to the ground plane and what plants are on the ground plane. If you're going to put more trees in your yard, think about those trees a little bit and think about the shape and the mature size and shape of those trees, and especially in the trunk, like multi-trunk or the branching. So one of the things about selecting your trees is that you can think about how the shape of the tree could create that special place and make your garden actually more functional. So I put a couple of photos in here. About one of them in the top left is a picture of a tree that is actually, studies have shown, is the tree form that most people like, or I should say like the most. And that is a wide arching canopy and a narrow trunk, and then some well-defined kind of Y-shaped branches. So that tree there, when you look at it, is very almost sculptural in its shape on its own. And that's why it can stand alone as in that, area which is just turf. The tree takes center stage and is dynamic enough, and the form is interesting to really be the plant in that space. I put, again, the photo of the pond there, a little bit closer look at the pond to show how that a pond can be more than just a pool of water. With turf going down to the edge, you can put plants all around the edge and in the water and create something more special with that pond. And then the picture on the right is a photo of a very large tree that was in a courtyard at Curtin University in Perth in Australia that everybody loved to go to because of the hanging basket chairs in the tree. And it was always nice and shady there, and a lot of pretty plant material. And it was really great place to go if you needed a break, and you could just go out and literally take a nap in the chairs. It was so comfortable. And so think about the functionality too, because once you create that shady spot, you're going to want to spend time in it because it's going to be a really pretty garden, and it's going to be comfortable physically to be in that garden. So the best colors for shade. Lighter, brighter colors will show up better in shade. So looking across the spectrum here, if we look at, kind of white or light kind of pastel colors going into bright yellows, bright pinks, light blues. Dark blues don't work so well. They have to be light, bright blue. Light purples almost glow in the shade gardens, and bright orange. Some colors that do not work very well in shade gardens are deep reds, darker reds that have actually maybe a little blue or purple in them that make them that really dark red, don't show up well. Deep purples and dark blues. So I'll show you an example here of a couple of gardens, and you'll see how different colors show better in these gardens. So obviously the photo on the far left with the bright yellows and the whites and the variegated, those colors, and white is one of them that's really good for shade gardens, literally glow in the shade. Where the middle picture, you see the dark purples and even off in the distance, some purples that really don't show very well in the shade. And the one that's most obvious is the small plant with the whites and pink flowers because of the contrast there. And then if you have a garden like an arch like this where you're creating shade with the arch, it's always fun to have a little color up above you, hanging down. All the color does not have to necessarily be on the ground plane. So think about in your trees, if you can have flowering trees or vines growing on trellises that add a little color to your landscape. And then just a couple of things about wildlife. If you do have a pond, ponds usually function better in shade. You have less problems with algae growing in them and other issues. Fish also prefer shade, so it's really important to have some shelters, water lilies, or other places where they can hide from full sun. And also your water will stay a little bit cooler. And fish do prefer a little bit cooler water. Warm water is not necessarily good for fish. They have certain temperature tolerance ranges that you have to pay attention to. Birds and small mammals like to escape the midday heat and shade, so providing some shady places for those will mean that you will attract more wildlife into your yard. If you create that environment where they'll do better. And frogs, turtles, and lizards, obviously, they all need shade on hot days too. So that even large mammals, these tigers were in the Jacksonville Zoo and didn't have a whole lot of shade in the afternoon in their enclosure. And so they picked the only shady spot they could find next to, actually it was a wall that was casting shade for them for their afternoon nap there. And just a couple more slides on hardscape. What's the best hardscape to use in a shade garden? Concrete and pavers tend to sometimes have algae and mold, moss or mildew growing on them. Like the picture of the curved stairway on the right. Those can often be cleaned quite well with a pressure washing a couple times a year. But one other option you might think about is loose aggregate, like the gravel that's in the other picture, because Water drains better in that loose aggregate, so it doesn't stay as wet and you won't have as much algae or mold growing on it. If you're using larger natural stones, the moss and the algae can actually make them look more natural. If you don't mind a little bit growing on the stones, and they're also a little bit easier to clean too if you're using larger stones. But I don't think, in my opinion, you wouldn't want to really clean them because the moss and algae would look fine on them. Wood you have to use with caution in a shade garden because the mold and the moisture will often rot the wood, fairly quickly. Even wood that has treated with preservatives. You can use some of the manufactured lumber that has a lot of plastic in it now, and those also are, the manufacturers say that they are mold and mildew resistant, and we have designed decks with the manufactured lumber and they stand up very well to shady areas. Other hardscape that you might consider is metal. So if you have, aluminum grates work really well, stainless steel works good, corten steel, things like that. They usually don't have any problem with the moisture issues and, mold or mildew on them. If you do have some wood structures in shady areas, if you paint them or seal them, that does help a lot. So this fence was an example of a mural that somebody had painted on it, and it was in a deep shade garden, but it was in pretty good shape, and the paint that was acting as a preservative there. They probably have to do an annual cleaning, but it was holding up quite well. And brick and masonry, if they get a little bit of moss or green algae on them, that also kind of lends itself more to a little bit of a natural weathered look. And so it's, maybe not quite as problematic from an aesthetic standpoint as the concrete would be. And so I just had to put these two pictures in because one of them is a lot of fun. This was a trip that to Turkey with Dr. Momol, actually, and a group of us went to Turkey. And it shows this one courtyard where the shade is totally created by vines growing from building top to building top over this courtyard. Very pleasant place to sit in, very shady, very nice. And it was a very hot day that day when we were out walking around. And then also I couldn't help but put this picture of what I think is a tree that has died. I'm not sure. It was by a beach, and so some enterprising person took it upon themselves to paint all the branches and the trunk white, and surprisingly it cast a lot of shade on the dining tables below. So that's some creative thinking there as far as creating shade, and it was pretty interesting and a lot of fun to look at, and there were actually several of them along the beach. So you never know, all different ways to get shade into your yard. Where can you go for inspiration? Well, I find that conservatories and botanical gardens are some of the best places that have some of the most magical and interesting shade gardens in them. And both of these pictures, I think, were taken at Kew Gardens in London, and they're beautiful conservatories that they have there. And then also natural areas can be a place for inspiration. This one with the roots out, that was at John Muir Park, just north of San Francisco, along a pathway where the roots of a tree that you can't see in the photo had been exposed when they cut the bank for the pathway. I thought it was actually very decorative and very interesting to see the pattern of the roots. And so nature can also be your inspiration. And with that, I think I'm probably out of time. So Tom, I'm open for questions now.
Gail, thank you so much. I'm so inspired with, you know, some of the photography and everything that that you had there. And it's, you know, it seems like I traveled the world a little bit there just watching your presentation. So thanks for sharing that. There are some questions that some folks had. Let's go all the way back to your garden that you had, your shade garden, where you had the gravel walkway where you were channeling water to it.
Yeah.
Question was, did you place perforated pipe and filter fabric underneath the gravel path?
Actually, I did not. And I worked with a good friend of mine who is a landscape architect also, and he owns a firm. I'm trying to click back to it real quick here. He owns a firm, a design build firm. So he was helping me with it. And we dug down probably about 4 inches there. And it was a beast of a job because there's a large magnolia tree fairly close by. And so there were some roots that were fairly close to the surface from the tree. But we dug down about 4 inches. We leveled off the bottom, a little bit of a V shape. So there was a little bit of a channel down the middle. And then there are metal edges. You can see them along the side there. We put down fabric and then put down the, actually that, what looks like pebbles there is crushed concrete stone. And then put the stepping stones in it. And it works wonderfully. It fills with water when it rains really hard, because I have quite a bit of water coming down my driveway. And just takes out water right around the corner of the house and out and down a hill. So I'm really happy with how it is functioning.
Well, it's really nice because you've got that permeable aspect of that walkway. So it's really doing double duty. It's, you know, not only serving as a walkway, but it's also getting rid of that water that you have, channeling that water away.
Yeah. And it, you know, there's still water. Some in a couple of really heavy storms that we had this summer, the water overflowed that and flowed into the rain garden, but I was perfectly fine with that because it was watering the plants, and it wasn't like the whole area was flooded. Most of the water was concentrated in the walkway.
Okay. Another person asked, do you have irrigation in your shade garden?
No, not at all. I don't. I only watered the plants regularly when they were getting established. During the summer, I rely on the rain, and then occasionally in the winter, when we've gone a couple weeks or maybe even 3 weeks without water, I'll go out, and especially like I have quite a few bromeliads, you probably noticed, in pots. I'll go out and water those, but other than that, the soil stays moist enough and cool enough there that it doesn't seem to be a problem at all. The oldest plant in that garden is the needle palm, which you can see the fronds of it there. And that needle palm is almost 30 years old. And when I first put it in the ground, it was just a couple of fronds, and it's so slow growing that now it's I think when you look at that, maybe about 6 feet wide, 6 by 6 kind of.
They're amazing plants.
Yeah, and I do literally almost nothing with that. Occasionally I'll trim some of the older fronds off the bottom there, but other than that, I don't do anything with it.
All right. There were a lot of questions coming in about, you know, where people can find plants and suggestions of plants for shady areas. And even, you know, a lot of people that were interested in natives. Some folks were sharing in the chat box the Florida friendly plant list and the apps that are free and available to people. So hopefully you'll find that those are useful tools. They've got a lot of natives in there. There certainly are more choices than, it's not an all-encompassing list. You know, you can always check with your the Florida Native Plant Society and you know, FAN, the Florida Association of Native Nurseries. You know, these are all places you can go. One of the things that I was thinking as people were writing in that people were looking for inspiration, and then you showed a slide right after I was thinking about it, was where people could go was botanical gardens.
Yes, that just one that pops into my head is Fairchild. They have a really nice shade garden area there. The Jacksonville Zoo also has another one. I actually meant to put another picture in here of their shade garden. So yes, botanical gardens, a really great place. Conservatories, great places. If you have a really good nursery in your area, they should have a place where they have all of their shade plants concentrated, oftentimes under a shade cloth or something. And if you look there, I mean, I discovered different plants. In fact, I just discovered, and I can't even remember the name of it right now, but a new ground cover, low growing ground cover that I have to go back and get it because I was told that it grows very well in shade, and it also does very well if you have to plant it around the base of a tree among the roots of the tree, because it'll take hold in just a little bit of soil, and it spreads, but not real aggressively. And so I need to go back and check out that plant. It was a brand new one that they had at the nursery, and it might not be good for South Florida or Central Florida, but because obviously it's a nursery here in Gainesville. But I think if you have a good nursery, they should have a good stock of shade tolerant plants also.
Yeah, and people are putting in the chat some great places to go, like Lou Gardens as well, and Mount's Botanical Garden in West Palm Beach, Fairchild, as you mentioned. These are all great places because a lot of the plants are labeled too. So if you find something you like, then you can do a little more research on it too.
Yeah, Selby Gardens, Marie Selby Gardens is another place I know where they have a lot of shade areas and good plants.
Definitely. Are you familiar with the Florida Sunshine Anise?
The anise or the ligustrum? The sunshine ligustrum?
There's actually a Florida Sunshine Anise as well, and
as well.
And they wanted to know how it does in shade. It should do fine in deep shade, but it's again one of the anise that has that yellow contrast, much like the Sunshine ligustrum does. But this one's an anise.
Yeah, and so I would assume that I'm not real familiar with it, but being an anise, I would assume it would do fine in shade.
And it would create that pop of color that you were mentioning, that bright look. Somebody wanted to know if you use BT in your bromeliads for the mosquitoes.
I use nothing in them. I have not. I don't know why. I think I'm up on a hill and we get a good breeze all the time, but I have never had a problem with mosquitoes in my yard. So I don't look for standing water or anything, because I can go outside and work in my yard any time of the year in, tank top and shorts, and mosquitoes are not a problem. And I don't know what it is, except that I'm up on a hill and a nice breeze comes. I have a golf course in my backyard, and a nice breeze comes across the golf course through my yard. And I don't know if that's why the mosquitoes don't find it a place to hang out, but I just don't have a mosquito problem.
Right. Someone's asking for a listing of shade plants for Hollywood, Florida. Again, that app that was listed in the chat, the Florida Friendly Plant List. It's a free app. You can just go to Florida Friendly Landscaping.com. And the apps are available there, or you can search for it on whether you have Android or an iPhone and download it directly. But that's certainly something that you could consider. The other thing is, don't forget about your local cooperative extension. That's your local county extension office can provide some good lists and good things as well. Gail, thank you so much for the inspiration. You've shown us so many cool ideas and new thoughts, and Like I say, you kind of gave us a little tour of the world as we got to see some different shots from around. And I have never been to your garden, but now I'm excited to come and visit sometime. So when you get back from your trip, maybe we'll have to schedule a time when I can stop by on my way home.
Come and
So
check it
I'd
out.
love to see it.
Well, as long as you don't go in the backyard's a mess. Just stay here in the front yard and you'll be fine.
Very good, Gail. Thank you so very much. And I just want to remind everybody out there that, we hope you have a really nice holiday season. Our next webinar, as Claire told you earlier, is January 11th. It's Dr. Phil Harmon, and we'll be talking about turf and landscape disease update. So thank you very much and happy holidays.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, everyone.